Hello and welcome to the Indie Bandits podcast. Joe here. In just a second, I'll be joined by Jimmy and Archie, and we'll be discussing violence in video games, including our first experiences with violent video games, ratings boards, and how sometimes video games are blamed for real-life violence. So, since we've been playing and talking about a lot of first-person shooters, I thought we could have a bit of a crack on today about violence in video games, which I'm sure, won't be problematic at all. But, we struggle to talk about first-person shooters without this coming up, so I thought it'd be better to just dedicate, an entire episode off to the side where we can vent or get it all out or, talk over violence in video games without getting sidetracked when we try and talk about games that are violent. So, to start the whole thing off, I thought I'd like to ask you what your first experience with violence in video games was. So I'll go to you first, James, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. Violence in video games, probably...
Bridge too far.
Crash Bandicoot.
Yeah, I guess it would be, but that's extremely minor violence, I guess, in the grand scheme of things. First properly violent video
It's just people killing each other.
It's tiny little sprite people on the screen. It's barely visible, but it was probably Mortal Kombat.
Yeah, that was the same one I had. I think in terms of graphic violence, I think we should maybe caveat that with visceral, gruesome violence.
Yes. I'm trying to think if there's maybe a shooter that I'd played around then, but I don't think there was. It probably was. It was probably some sort of combat game, like a Mortal Kombat, a fighting game. Certainly the most vivid memories I've got in terms of violent video games would be Mortal Kombat, even if it might not necessarily have been the first one.
What about yourself, Archie? What's the first violent video game you recall playing?
Well, I was gonna say I think it was probably like something like Resident Evil 2.
Crash
I remember
Bandicoot.
playing that. It was definitely Crash Bandicoot when you stomp on those crabs. Yeah. In terms of kind of I guess try to replicate real world violence. Even I know Resident Evil 2's got zombies, so it's exaggerated and all that. But I remember the death screen where you got killed. The blood would splatter on the screen and it'd spell you died. But if I cast my memory further back, I think it was actually. Did you remember the Die Hard trilogy game that was on PS1?
No.
I had a demo for it. Is the second one with the airport?
There was
level? You're in an airport and you just move a cursor around to shoot things. It's
1/3 of the game was a real shooter. The other was a third-person shooter, and the other one was a driving game. And it was specifically that driving game one where you were either in a taxi or something like that. And when you ran people over, your windscreen would be covered in blood. And I think this was a first-person perspective as well. And your windscreen wiper would wipe off the blood. And I think in terms of violence, that was probably the first thing I ever saw in a game that wasn't a colourful, cartoon platformer where it's oh yeah, people are dying. You know what I mean?
So how old would you have been around that time?
7 maybe, 7 or 8. It would have been because of playing so.
I was gonna say because if before we get on to do video games encourage real life behaviors and we cover that. Mm-hmm. I think we should add that you don't have a driver's license, Archie, so it clearly hasn't encouraged you to emulate that behaviour that much at all.
Maybe he was terrified he was going to run people over all the time.
Yeah, my solicitor would say otherwise, but carry on.
I guess the original Grand Theft Auto, that makes me that was an early violent game that I played. Again, kind of weird violence because it was so unrealistic.
It was top down, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it was a very violent game though.
Yeah, it was no more violent. I know there was blood in it, but it was no more violent than Tom and Jerry. You know what I mean? It was all very cartoony and exaggerated, and you knew...
The original Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, the top down.
Mm-hmm. A lot of games from that time, even it was so exaggerated and so over the top, and because the fidelity of the graphics and all that was so low, you never believed it to be real. At least I didn't. You knew it was a fantasy kind of thing.
Well, I think the deaths, obviously, I think that there's a whole different issue with Grand Theft Auto where it's not inherently the violence, it's more so the not telling you, it's the fact that you're committing actual real life crimes. So even if the deaths aren't as graphic, because I was thinking of that kind of graphical fidelity, Lemmings was probably more gruesome at points than than the early GTAs when you're watching people from a bird's eye view getting splattered. It was all like you said, it's all very Tom and Jerry, very comical, even though it's someone who's stolen a car and is mowing down pedestrians, which in real life is absolutely horrendous, but in a top-down game where they are little more than a few blobs of color, and then they explode into this what looks like someone hit a ketchup sachet with a hammer. I think it's hard to take it seriously, and you'd hope someone who was over the age recommended by the game would know that they can't just jump in their car and do that, and those under the age, well, wouldn't technically have access to cars or guns. You'd hope, but obviously, same as both of yous. Fighters were like my earliest foray into like violent games, and I regularly played Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, and obviously we need to talk about Mortal Kombat because over in the US that was one of the first games that really kicked up a fuss, and I think it was because there was the presence of blood in it, not because it was necessarily fighting, because I remember there was a lot of games like that. You had Street Fighter, you had like Streets of Rage, and it didn't seem that those were much of a bother, but it was the fact that Mortal Kombat had you rip spines.
Yeah, it was like an insane level of violence, wasn't it? It was almost
well, that's the thing.
It was taking a lot of not pleasure is probably not the right word, but there was so much focus on the violence that maybe people thought like they've purposefully added this extreme level of violence as opposed to just what you might consider to be realistic violence. If you shoot someone or stab someone or run them over with a car, those are things that you think, oh well, that's a thing that happens in this game, so we've put it. That's a thing, yeah, that can happen in real life, so we've put it in this game. But Mortal Kombat was like, well,
it was silly. People had about 20 rib cages in that game. If
yeah,
no, but it did. If there were like certain fatalities where they would just spawn sprites of various bones when like someone gets exploded into bits, and in many cases there was like several skulls and several rib cages coming out of the same person. Like the realism wasn't there, which is gross and disgusting as it all is. It was so like beyond realistic. It was almost fantasy, really.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people thought it was maybe glorifying like violence for the sake of violence rather than as a byproduct of like something that happened in the game. It was kind of like,
definitely. It made violence cool as fuck. Like, I know this sounds awful, but as a kid, like, and I know you were the same, Jim. Like, if we played Mortal Kombat, which we regularly did, I think it was the third one I had on the Super Nintendo around my nan's house. Regularly play that. I remember the movie coming out, and weren't able to go see that because we were too young to go to the cinema to see it. But I remember for my one of my cousins' birthdays, fell at around the time it was coming out for rental.
Right.
So I was up their house in back in the mid 90s when that Mortal Kombat movie came out, and we rented it, and it was me, my cousins, and a load of my cousins' mates. There was probably about 10 of us there all watching this film. The second that film finished, we turned off the VHS and we all went out into his garden and knocked 7 shades of shit out of each other. Like, that was just the plan. We're like, right, Mortal Kombat time. We all just ran in the garden and had a big fight. Like,
thus answering the question once and for all.
So you ripped off your cousin's head.
But obviously within our ability, obviously none of us were trying to like gouge each other's eyes out, but we did have like a proper. We all went out and just had a big brawl in his garden.
Joe's cousin throws Joe into a big bed of spikes as well.
Yeah.
Fatality.
And then we're all scrapping in the garden. Then my aunt's like, "Get over here!" And then we're all bollocked. But it was like, I can see how like people have concerns. I can see how parents more importantly than anyone could have concerns about games being violent. But also, it is kind of like down to the parents. Like, if that was a concern, maybe my aunt shouldn't have got like 10 young lads to watch a violent film based on a violent computer game that they all loved.
A lot of the time with this, the onus is on the parents to kind of look after their children, make sure they're not playing these violent games. Like, fair enough, I'll have some, like Mortal Kombat back in the day, there was no ratings board for games, and I think Mortal Kombat brought in the ratings board, like, at least games like that. There was no ASRB or PEGI, and the BBFC over here didn't do any classification on those things.
They did some. I was looking into this.
Okay.
There, the BBFC did classify certain games, but only if they had certain criteria.
Yeah, it's really
it met
weird.
certain criteria, and it was like sex or criminality or something like that. But no, like video games were obliged to send them anything or something like that. It was a really odd state of affairs over here.
Yeah, like I do believe there was this idea back then, and probably still to this day, is that like games were like a thing for kids, like a young boy's hobby, probably because of like Mario and Sonic were the biggest things, and no one expects something like Mortal Kombat to come out or Doom or something like that, and it to be this ultra violent like game for adults, really. And everyone's like, oh, it's a cute. It's not cute, but you know what I mean. It's a game. I can stick this on, and my son or daughter, or whatever, can just play this happily. Because there's not going to tell them it's an adult game, really, other than maybe the name.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, Mortal Kombat was originated in arcades, though, which I think is maybe how it could have slipped under the radar, because if kids are I assume it's like kids who are old enough to go to the arcades on their own are seeing this game, and the parents aren't going with them. I assume, like, it was commonplace that, we didn't have much of an arcade scene in the early 90s. I remember there was, maybe 2 arcades in, like,
Maybe.
one in town, one in the Metro Centre, maybe.
Within like 100 miles of us.
Yeah, like, you just didn't go to arcades very often. I remember they were so damn expensive as well.
And terrible.
Like, yeah, but it was like, it was like a quid a go of a game, and you hear Americans talking about a quarter to play a game. Sorry, but if games were 25 pence, for example, which, again, 25 pence is still more than a quarter, but, if they were 25 pence, you'd get 4 times as many games out of them. In the UK, a quid a pop. Back in the mid-90s, having a fiver or a tenner to go out with would get you 5 goes on a game. You couldn't spend all afternoon there. You'd be in there for about an hour at best, and that's only if you took turns and watched your mates play. But obviously, the original Mortal Kombat was in these arcades, and I assume parents weren't with their kids, so it kind of was something that just kids did and parents didn't realize was happening. Like smoking around the back of a bus shelter or something like that. These kids are playing Mortal Kombat. The parents assume, like, computer games are like Donkey Kong and Sonic and Mario and whatever.
You reckon all the parents were assuming that about a game called Mortal Kombat?
Well, they wouldn't have known they were even playing it. Do you know what I mean? Like,
they would still look at it at some level. Like, the kid wouldn't have bought it. Like,
no, but I'm saying in the arcades when it wasn't until they reached when they were out in the arcades, parents probably had no idea the kids were playing something called Mortal Kombat and had loads of blood and all this gruesome shite in it.
And what was that one there was always that shooter game set in that, like, haunted house or something, wasn't there?
House of the Dead.
House of the Dead. That was a really popular arcade. That was all over the place. That one.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, like, parents would have no idea that their kids were off, like, violently. Well, Mortal Kombat is, I think, a bit earlier than House of the Dead. But anyway, they were doing all these, like, playing all these violent games. And I don't think it was until it ended up in the house where, like, parents are, like, picking up a Mortal Kombat for console, and it was only the Mega Drive that had, like, the fully violent version of it, I believe, initially. And the Super Nintendo had the, like, painted the blood blue or something and said it was sweat coming off them, like 2 boxes.
Green's usually a nice safe colour to go to, I think.
Green was for I remember green was Reptile's blood in the ones with blood. I never had the versions with sweat in it.
You look at games around about that time, the early 90s, and I don't think even with the level of violence that was being presented back then, it was any different to the film industry even earlier than that. And I'm like, if you look at something like RoboCop, for example, that scene at the start, I can't remember what the big android is, but when they're showing it off, they're basically selling this big bipedal robot, and it just shoots one character to bits, and there's all this blood just bursting out of this one character, and it's like, it's tremendously violent, but it's like, it's like a lot of fun. It's intended for its age audience and all that. And it seems like games got a lot of stick for being violent. Well, I'm assuming the film industry did as well. I'm sure they had their own set of laws that had to come in to try and like maybe keep that.
Well,
at
they
bay,
have the classifications. I think
Yeah,
that was the problem.
it probably
Films
was.
had classifications, so you know, we have just the numeric system here in the UK, like you. But anyway, yeah. So we had that numerical system in the US. They would have had the same. A lot of other places had their own ways to like say who could and couldn't go see a film, because you know films did have their own like crack on for having shit they didn't want people to see in them. Like, you know, apparently, you know, The Exorcist got into loads of trouble with the Catholic Church for, don't know why they were so upset about that film, but you know, they
because it's really good.
It's not.
Oh no, I love The Exorcist. Anyway, meandering.
But back to game, yeah, the games weren't effectively rated in that kind of way, and it wasn't until them looking at Mortal Kombat and some other games that like they created the ASRB, because the games industry was like, shit, if they start rating games for us, we're screwed. So we have to, if we opt in, effectively, they said we'll regulate ourselves. You don't have anything to worry about, and that's how they create the ASRB, and that kind of gives at least devs a bit more freedom in that respect, because they know it's their own industry regulating them, not some like outside auditors or whatever.
Yeah, like before, when games in development, before it's even released, it has to go for age rating. You have to send off not a bill that to be played, but you have to show every single display of like violence, sex, and language. And these things, from what I know of them, are very, very sensitive on how it upscales your age rating. If you take kind of like a platform, for instance, like violence in them is always like cartoony. So you know how Mario steps on the mushrooms, for instance, and they just get squashed and they disappear.
Goombas, yeah.
But if it implies too much that the mushrooms die, if you know what I mean, like
Or suffer,
then that's, even though it's the exact same action, if there's like a splat or something, that would up the age rating.
Blood curdling scream from a mushroom.
Exactly.
Yeah, or you hear the Goomba's death rattle as it like breathes its final breath.
But it shits itself.
Yeah.
But regardless of all these, it's. I mean, if you look at games, I mean, we've had Grand Theft Auto, which was at the time a violent game. But if you look at where things are now, with at least the latest Mortal Kombat, these rules doesn't seem to have stopped any level of violence. I mean, I don't know if you've seen like Mortal Kombat 11 and some of the kills in there. They're fucking ridiculous.
Apparently, they got around this by making them ridiculous.
Yeah, well,
like,
that's the thing.
Apparently,
yeah.
it's a point if they make them beyond violent. Like, there's a certain thing where it's so beyond real that that they sort of get away with it. I don't know how else
Yeah.
it's exaggerated. Because it's exaggerated to such an extent, it's actually considered less violent than if it was really realistic.
I mean, I think it's the Americans are more sensitive to this kind of thing than we are. Like Australia as well, they're really sensitive to kind of like...
They have a really strict level.
They do not, like, from what I know about Australia, they just do not care about the industry in the same way they care about film industry over there. Games get banned very easily, like an example of like in Left 4 Dead. If you shot the zombies in there, they would just lie on the ground and they would just remain on screen. And there'd be blood, and I think in the Australian version of Left 4 Dead, they had to remove the blood, and the zombies' bodies had to like dissipate over time or something, just to get that age rating down, so they could release it in that country. Like they're really, really strict over there. It's like
I do hear a lot of crack on from like Australian players and like Australian media outlets, like bemoaning just how little you can get away with in terms of like I guess sensitive content, you'd have to call it in games in Australia. Obviously, we're, like you said, over in Europe, we're seemingly like a little bit more lax or less readily upset by it than the North American market. But then again, you've like for many years, it might still be ongoing. Germany has a problem with anything relating to the Nazis, and game devs love hiring Nazis into a game. So
only so we can kill them.
Well, generally, yeah, but like they just in Germany, they're just having none of it. They're like, nah, in no way, shape, or form can like Nazis be in games. I think they've since eased that, but I know in like early Wolfensteins and stuff, you were fighting robots, not Nazis, and things like that. There's a lot of games where they just like wholesale lift out any reference to Nazism, and like even in like Wolfenstein, you'll walk straight into a castle which would have banners of like swastikas in like any other version of the game, but in the German version, they're all gone. They just like take it all out and they're like, nah, sorry, that's a hard no from us on on anything relating to Nazism.
I mean, I don't know if any of you guys played God of War 3 that came out about 10, 12 years ago now. That game had tremendous levels of violence, but it was so fun. It's like, I don't want to sound mature of doing that, but kind of exaggerated violence that isn't odd entertainment value to it. There's one bit in God of War 3, where I think you're fighting... who's the guy with the wings on his feet, James? You'll know this.
Hermes.
Hermes, you're fighting Hermes. I think you just fucking rip his head off.
That's hype. That's with Hermes, you chop his legs off.
Do you?
With
okay.
I think is it Hyperion?
Yeah.
The one in the chariot, the sun god.
Yeah, and he opens his mouth and it's...
Yeah, I think he's the one you rip the head off.
But like the camera pans in like
him,
real
Apollo?
close.
I can't
like,
remember who it
You've
is.
just got to bash the square button and Kratos, the characters you play. You just see all the tendons in the person's neck just like ripping apart in this face of anguish. He's like, ah! And eventually you rip his fucking head off and you're like, somehow that got through a fucking classification board and got released. But I kind of got
I assume it was like, Peggy 18 or...
Oh, I think it was. Hang on.
But I don't think is it? I can't remember if something's rated Peggy 18. You have to be 18 to buy it in the UK.
I think Peggy's more of a recommendation than anything else.
Yeah, like the advisory lyrics on albums.
But when I was working in retail, we could not sell. We just treat Peggy the same way we treat the BBFC ratings. It's like we can't sell this below this person's age.
I think at a certain point, the games get both once they meet that criteria I was talking about, where they get classified by the BBFC, which is the British Board for Film Classifications, for those outside the UK, and Peggy, so you have both labels on it, which I think once it gets the BBFC label, I think that's when it would legally affect your ability to buy it, and I think that lines up almost all the time. I don't think there's ever an instance where a BBFC classification isn't the same as the Peggy one. Like, if you see like something that has like Peggy 18 on it, there'll also be just a regular 18 sticker on it as well.
So the funny thing about this is you can put like all these tremendous levels of violence in a video game. Like this stuff is like really like over the top and grotesque, and it's kind of the point of a lot of the time. And sometimes you get more like realistic violence. I think in the newest Call of Duty, I've heard that they put in like weird realistic deals where if you shot somebody like in the head or something,
they die.
They would die, yeah. But you would see like the NPC's eyes roll to the back of the head and all that. They would have like they were going for like realism with it. They said, "Look, we're going to try and."
That's grim.
Whether they were successful or not, I haven't played the most recent one, but yeah, I guess your gauge of how you approach the violence changes on the tone you're going for. So you can put all this in, but you can't put sex in games. It always has to be implied or something. And again, if you go back to like God of War, it was a bit sad. You had the sex mini games. It's a bit like cringe when you think back to it now. But the camera would always pan away. Like, and I know Far Cry 3 had a sex scene in, like a POV sequence, but even then there was something like, I don't know, I can't remember the context of that scene, but sex really puts your rating through the roof, in America at least, I think. And I think that's what you never ever... Not that I'm like, I really want this in my video games, like... But,
I just have an encyclopedic knowledge of every sex scene in every video game.
I'll just go through me diary. But, that seems more taboo than the violence. Like, you know what I mean? Like...
Well, it's the same with language, isn't it? That was the whole premise of the South Park movie back in the day, where it was like, deplorable violence is okay as long as nobody says a naughty word.
That's crazy, man.
Like, a few F-bombs will put your rating up more than mowing down civilians will.
I just don't get the entire argument anyway. I know we'll probably sort of delve into it a little bit, but like, the people who come out and have a major issue with violence in video games or violence in movies, or what they're trying to scapegoat the reason for their child being a violent person or someone in the neighborhood turning out to be extremely violent. Like, human history isn't, pre-video games and pre-movies isn't littered with like moments of extreme violence. You're like, no, we have a history of this. Human beings are just on some level naturally predisposed to being fairly violent towards each other. It's not
Well, I think
video
there's
games.
I think there's the whole like causality argument. It's like, are violent people caused by playing violent games, for example, or do violent people gravitate towards violent games because they're already violent and like that kind of crack on? It might be a case that there's violent people hate violent games because, they're just like, it just doesn't do it for them. They must be like, the same reason people at the moment are kind of like, I don't get the crack on with esports now that all my sports are gone. Some people are shifting over. Some people are like, great, like any level, any type of competition. I don't care if it's like real or virtual. I'll take it both. But maybe, there might be people like, I don't want virtual violence. What's this shit? I want to see people genuinely getting hurt, not just pretend people in a game. Like, it might not do anything for inherently violent people to
I would just
I don't think there's such a strong overlap as like they always seem to indicate in this kind of crack on.
No, I just think people who are inherently violent are going to be violent regardless of the stimulus around them, whether that's video games, whether that's TV shows or movies. People who are predisposed to violence will tend to be violent, and that's just kind of the way it is. I've played a lot of violent video games. I've watched a lot of violent movies. I don't go around being violent to anybody. And the vast, vast majority of 7 billion people on the planet are probably exactly the same.
And like, if you look at like things back in the day as well, you said, Joe, as well, you played Mortal Kombat with your cousins when you were younger. And do you remember when like wrestling was popular? We would have been like 10, 11, 9 years old, whatever. Everyone was playing wrestling, and even
the wrestling we did was more real than the actual wrestling.
Yeah, and it's like,
because we thought wrestling was real.
But when you do it, you and your friends, you're doing it as like a fantasy, if you know what I mean. You're not actually trying to hurt your mates. You remember, like, you're always doing it with a little bit of caution. You're not actually like slamming your friends.
Oh no, the Mortal Kombat story, we were like trying to kick fuck out of each other. This wasn't like, it was genuine, just competitive fighting in the garden. It wasn't us like, we weren't pretending to do moves and being like, get over here. We were actually just having a fight.
All right, okay. Well, the people I played fights with
with wrestling, you're right.
Yeah.
We're just getting an insight into Joe's violent past here.
Probably because of all the video games he's been playing.
Oh, yeah.
That was technically after a film, just saying.
But, yeah, I don't think there is, and there's no evidence to show any, like, correlation between violent games, like, kind of influencing regular, everyday people, because I know so many people who've grown up playing video games, violent ones, watching violent films. And as far as I know, they're pretty, quiet individuals who haven't done anything wrong to anybody else.
Well, to like pull out the massive like nerd stereotype kind of thing, it seems that like most people, if you go on the nerd stereotype of people who play games, are generally the people who are like on the receiving end of violence, like growing up through school, whatever. They're the ones that are like. Well, back in the day, I think games are more have a more global appeal now and more universal appeal than they did back in the 90s. But now, I think being someone who plays games doesn't automatically make you a nerd anymore. In the early 90s, it felt like that was the thing. If you told someone you had a Nintendo or a Sega or were playing on your computer, automatically a nerd. But also it was the same. It was just assumed, at least in secondary school, it was assumed if you were in higher level classes, you were effectively weaker and less violent, and more prone to computer games and less prone to playing sports. So if that's the case, then how can people playing games also be the violent ones if they're meant to be absolute?
The argument
wusses?
just doesn't make any sense. Like, I just checked there that apparently there are now more than 2.5 billion active gamers around the world.
So 1/4 of people in the world are inherently violent.
Apparently, yeah, there are 2.5 billion acts of extreme violence going on around the world at any given time from all these gamers who are playing these violent videos. Like, if there was a correlation between people who watch violent films, TV shows, and play violent games, if you did one of those things or all three of those things, the world would be consistently like something out of a dystopian post-apocalyptic nightmare. Like, everyone would just be murdering and looting every 5
Each day
seconds.
a step closer, Jim.
It'd be the prologue from Warhammer, was it? Like there was no peace in the universe, there was only war, or whatever it is. Like.
In the grim darkness of the future, there is only war.
There is only
It's the
gamers.
Warhammer 40k.
Like, if there was even just a tiny correlation, the world would be like on fire 90% of the time. We just think that's not the way it is. That can't possibly be, because even if there are 2.5 billion gamers, I guarantee it's probably half the population that have watched some form of violent TV show or violent movie. So you're talking half the population that are apparently predisposed because of these things that they watch to going out and being extremely violent towards you. No, it's just not the case.
I was going to say, like, does any other country really, like, complain about violence in video games other than the Americans? Because I don't see the argument being made anywhere. We don't, like, the UK doesn't make the argument for it that much.
There was that guy who went around and throttled his neighbour because he was winding him up on Call of Duty. I'll find a link to that story. I've sent this one to you before, actually, where it was this oldish bloke.
I've seen that.
And I'm saying, like, in his 30s or 40s or something like this. And he was playing Call of Duty online against, like, the neighbour kid or whatever. And the neighbour kid was, like, griefing him to shit. And basically just, like, lost his fucking marbles, like, turned off the console, walked out his house, walked around the kid's house, knocked on the kid's door, and then just started throttling him. Like, you little git, like, don't grief me online. And you're like, mate, you are, like, if that's your reaction
to getting
beat online, like, you have something wrong. You have a screw loose, and it wasn't the game that was winding him up. It's not that he went out and shot the kid. It was I think just the competitive nature of the game, which makes me feel if this person was playing flipping Tricky Towers or Tetris or, you know, some puzzle game but competitively, and some kid was griefing him, I think you'd have the same reaction.
No, of course
like,
you would.
I don't think it was probably about him losing, because I bet you that, I don't know if the article ever said whether he was getting pwned like a little noob or whether he was like on a 25 kill streak, because I bet you if he was on a 25 kill streak and this kid was griefing him, he wouldn't have walked around his house and throttled him.
Possibly, yeah. But it's like, for me, the argument for all this only ever seems to come from, like, if I'm wrong, I'll happily accept I'm wrong, but it generally does seem to come from the right-wing American media. Like, most of the time, like, I don't know any other cases where us in the UK or anywhere else in Europe have ever complained about the level of violence in video games. Like, when I said before, like, Mass Effect, when that came out, that had a sex scene in that game. And of course I remember it did. But,
how many of these are you going to mention?
That's going to be a Crash Bandicoot thing. But that was in, like, Fox News, where they were saying, a game where you can perform sexual acts and do this, that, and they got these people on to talk about
because
a game.
no one was having sex until they saw it in video games.
Yeah, I know, like, exactly.
Thousands of years of human history, and people are like, I have no idea what to do. If only there was some kind of entertainment media that told me how to do this.
Yeah, and like when Grand Theft Auto comes out, it's always a game where you can abduct and shoot prostitutes as a mission or something, where they're just kind of like, they're taking something that kind of can be done in a game but is never an objective and putting it forward as kind of like, this is only what the fucking game's about. Like, and I know we had that talk about the no Russian thing, and like, you know, there's probably more sides to the story of that other than that being a violent thing, but like, they're kind of putting across of that no Russian being the only thing you do in Call of Duty is disguise yourself as a terrorist and shoot the innocent. And it's just not the case, you know what I mean? It's like, I mean, yeah, I think, but it's always a scapegoat for, I don't know, it is like for maybe gun violence or something else, or, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, it's just amazing how often, like, well, you know, when something horrible happens, and it does occasionally happen, and really the statistics show that it happens a lot more in the United States of America than it does in most other parts of the world. I'm talking about gun violence and awful, awful moments, but the first thing that gets blamed, not the fact that there's ready access to guns, but often the first thing that gets blamed is video games and shooting games. They always look to see if the person who's committed the crime was an avid Call of Duty player or something. Like, that's the cause of it. Like, it's not the guy has got, or the girl has got, like, serious mental issues and easy access to high-powered killing machines. Like,
I
come
don't think
on.
you have to even say girl. This is the weird thing about it, but it's this is a kind of thing where you can stereotype it. It's often white males.
Yeah.
When it comes to if we're going to look at, because it's always school shootings that tends to be the one where they go to, because that's obviously when the killer is usually in their teens, usually attends said school, and more often than not is a white male, and
Plays violent video games.
and plays violent video games. For one, I think you'd go across, in the last 20 years, we are 3 white males. Sorry, but like, you take a cross section of most white males of our age, and the next generation, there's a large cross section of them that like video games. Like, it's a popular hobby amongst white males, especially in the US. To play video games. That's like saying he also liked pizza. Do you know what I mean? He liked pizza, and what else is he doing with his time between eating pizza and playing Call of Duty and whatever?
All right.
But apparently, here's the stat: a study on these shootings showed that only 12% of school shooters actually had an interest in video games.
There you go.
So only 1 in 10 of them even played video games, and everyone plays video games was the the point I'm trying to make. So it's this subsection that seemingly are like the worry.
There's a general, I don't know, like a fear maybe, or just unwillingness of people to deal with uncomfortable truths when it comes to awful crimes. And the uncomfortable truth a lot of the time is that the person was predisposed to being violent and unpredictably violent. And there isn't
And
often
maybe
always
shouldn't have had access to this deadly killing machine,
it's just like,
given their condition.
yeah, and like the uncomfortable truth is there was probably very little anyone could do really to stop that person committing an act of violence at some point. Now, what level of act of violence could be mitigated by not giving them access to assault weapons?
To the tools. Yeah.
But that person was probably predisposed to violence and may have committed a violent act. I think people just hate the idea of the fact that human beings are predisposed to some are yes, can be predisposed to being somewhat violent, and people who have a particular issue, and I don't know what that issue is, but there's clearly something, as you said, like a screw loose or something. The idea that someone could unpredictably commit something so violent is very uncomfortable for people to come to terms with, because there's no way to stop that from happening. Because it's just
all you can do is mitigate the risk
Yeah.
that when it does happen, because you'll see it over and over again. There's this kind of like recurring theme when anything like this happens, where people go, oh, well, they didn't seem unhinged or anything like that. They were quiet, kept to themselves, or or friendly, nice person. It always seems that there's all you can't tell most of the time. And if you do have the smallest inkling, then maybe that's the time when you should be thinking about what they can and can't get their hands on. And again, like I said, with video games and with alcohol, like, I wouldn't like someone to take those things away from me, especially on account of, one person. And I don't even want to say one bad person, because in a lot of cases they have problems and probably should have, been given help at an earlier stage. But one person acting badly sort of ruins something that, like, many of us are passionate about. I like a drink. I like playing computer games. And, having grown up in the UK, I couldn't say one thing or another about guns or gun ownership. It's never been something that's particularly fascinated me. But over there are a lot of people who love their guns. It's like people who love their cars. Do you know what I mean? And if so, you can't take all the cars off the road because someone drives it like an idiot.
Yeah, but it seems to be a different argument for video games. You've got these people that do try and there'll probably be some like extremely, as Archie pointed out before, like very right wing conservative people over there who probably would defend the American Constitution with their lives, and owning a gun is absolutely fine, but they will not stand for violent video games because
No.
it's a lot easier for people to try and find a reason, or I don't know, maybe they feel more comfortable if they can fabricate a reason for something bad happening. It's very difficult for people to come to terms with the fact that there may have been no reason for what just happened. It's like people can't quantify it. Like, I don't get it. Why did that happen? It's like, well, because sometimes bad things happen. Yes, of course, we want to stop them from happening, but sometimes they happen. And I think a lot of the times people just cannot deal with accepting that. And so they try and find a reason for it. And more often than not with violence, especially gun violence, it ends up coming back to some video game that's just been released.
I was going to ask, is there any limit to the level of violence you can have in a video game? I mean, what makes violence in games alright against what makes violence not appropriate, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, where's the
Where
line?
is the line? Because I think we probably all have a line. And I bring this up because there was a game that was going to come out on Steam in fucking the last couple of years or something. I think it was called Hatred. And the whole concept of that game is you were just some scumbag who was going into people's houses, shooting and killing the innocent. And you can probably still get it. I think that's what it was about. I might be wrong on that. I'm pretty sure that was the premise. But I think Steam pulled it and said, no, we don't want this fucking trash on our like. So there seems to be even certain levels people don't find acceptable. Even people who are like, in the industry and like, no, you can't fucking do that.
Well, I guess
It's individual.
yeah,
isn't
that
it?
just comes down to what people like and what they don't like.
Mm-hmm.
But again, what I'd say is like, yeah, each of us would draw a different line in the sand. But I'm very much on almost everything that doesn't, because obviously the question you're asking is more like where is the line for us? What we think is too violent.
Mm-hmm. Is there a line even? Is there? Can we do anything we want? Like,
Everyone has their own line, is what I would say. Right, but that's just a limit on how much or how little violence you want in your game. Obviously, we'll put aside to like whether they cause violence and everything like that. Ignoring all of that, because that's the reason, like where probably when a line has to be drawn, it's down to that.
yeah.
If something's so violent that it would be somehow detrimental to the well-being of people. That's when obviously like platforms and devs and whatever may have to pull the game themselves. But if you live in a world where the games only end up in the hands of the people who can safely play them and will not be like harmed by them, then I say like, there will be games that I hate and probably don't think should exist, but it's not my place to say that shouldn't exist. If people want to buy it,
Yeah.
like, and it's the same. Like I don't condone violence against others. Like I love a good violent video game, but I'm inherently not at all a violent person. And there might be a point where I find a game where I'm like, oh my god, that was too violent. I did not need that, and go, not for me, not going to play it, and then just leave it at that. But I don't think you can until there's any evidence that these games are good. Like there's a level of violence that will become a danger to people. I think you have to let anything go.
I think there's some things that can just be considered like completely inappropriate in most like violence against like children, for example. Like nobody surely wants to play something like that, if you know what I mean. And you never see
There
it.
will be people.
Oh, fucking sickos, man. I mean, that's something you just don't want to do, really.
Probably.
Yeah,
Or maybe they just want to do it in games.
Yeah. Like, in the latest Call of Duty, there is, like, an instance where you could shoot, like, a kid, but the minute you do it, it's, like, an instant game over. It's like, no, you can't. It's like, what the fuck?
Why
It
put the
gives you, like, a line.
functionality? Yeah, but why put that in? That seems dumb. Like, why on earth would they put the functionality in to do that just so that it could then put a screen up afterwards to say,
I've absolutely no
what on
idea.
earth are you doing? Like,
So
you're the one
we
who
talk
spent
about it.
you're the one who spent hours and hours and hours programming that into a game. Like, isn't that weirder? Is that not
Is it a bit
weirder to
weird?
have the thought to put that
That's
in
a shock value
Yes.
tactic.
than to actually do the thing. Like just before when you said that, was it called Hatred? Did you say there was a game called?
Hatred, yeah, that one.
That's where I would draw the line, purely just because I would start to question the mentality of the people who made the game. I'd be like, why on earth were they sat around thinking, let's make a game where you are just pointlessly violent to everybody that you come across? I would start to question like the reason for making the game in the first place at that point. I'd be like, this is just a bit weird. In the same way that I would probably question, and this is just my like opinion, but I would question like a game that had no reason other than, well, if we just stick to violence, like just that to be like utterly violent for no reason whatsoever. Like I think if there's a purpose to it, and even if that purpose is something I wouldn't condone in real life, like say a war game, I can understand why the violence is there. I can understand why it was programmed into the game. But if we go back to Call of Duty, that level, that no Russian level, that to me just seemed a weird thing to spend the time and effort to program into the game when there was no... There didn't seem to be much of a reason to have that level in the game. That's where I guess it's not necessarily the actual violence itself. It's more like
it's the mentality behind.
I'm questioning why it was put in there in the first place. Yeah, I find it. I get baffled by it. I guess more than anything, I'm just a bit confused as to why.
I think I'm probably on the same page.
Up.
Like I'm usually fine with something as long as it's got the context to back it up, and that context can be something like a serious situation where you've got to kill innocent so and so, maybe maybe not fucking young person or anything like that, but in order to progress the story in a certain way, and I don't mind that kind of stuff as long as it's backed up correctly and has correct context, against more silly violence in Mortal Kombat where the context is that the whole game is just fucking ridiculous. But I think when it becomes violence for violence sake, a lot of the time it feels like I don't understand the point of this, and it becomes like meritless, and that's when it becomes a bit like like murky and mucky, if you know what I mean. It's like
when it's violence that feels like it. Mortal Kombat, I'll go back to what we discussed at the start. Like the violence in that is so over the top and ridiculous that it becomes a fantasy. It becomes something a bit silly. It's a bit of a joke. These are fake characters. It's a crazy world. And yes, they're all in this ridiculous tournament in different realms of the universe fighting. You know what I mean? It's stupid, right? It's like it's already over the top and silly. But when you add, like, I wasn't even aware that game existed, that Hatred game. But that to me,
I don't think
like,
it does technically exist. It's right. You know what I mean?
But
I don't think it's
trying to have this like real world simulator where you go around committing like real world violence on people for no discernible reason. If people want to play that, fine. But to me, it's just like I'm confused why it exists. I guess.
Yes.
It starts to make me think like, why did someone come up with this idea and then spend all that time putting it into, and then selling it to people? It seems an odd idea to sell for me.
I think you're right. You'd have to like question where is especially when you're making something like a video game, you're thinking of the maybe the entertainment value as well as the artistic value.
Yeah,
and something where you're going into it and the whole objective is to just murder the innocent for no reason other than you're full of hatred. To me, it just seems like I like you again, James. I'm questioning the mentality of these people integrating these features and this like gameplay loop. But again, if you like that and want to play that, who am I to stop them?
Well, that's exactly the way I'd say it. It seems all green. I think like games like that, if people want to make them, then go ahead. I'm very much I sit exactly the same place when it comes to comedy and jokes as well. I think you can't put lines down anywhere, because I don't think in something that is not real, i.e. a joke and video games, it's not real, so it's our choice whether we want to play this game.
Yes,
it's our choice whether we want to listen to X comedian, whether you find them offensive or not. And it's the same I've always been with all media I consume. It's not like we live in an age where there's a lack of it. It's not like you can't just go watch something else, play something else, listen to something else. There's a lot of music I don't like. If I don't like it, I don't listen to it. I don't go to the bars where they play it. If there's a film I don't like, I don't go.
No
I
one's
can
forcing
stop
you to
watching it.
consume all this content.
No, if a game comes out and it has you do some like things that I would think in the real world are abhorrent, if people want to do it in a game in the comfort of their own home, and there's no evidence that causes them then to replicate those acts in the real
Which
world,
there isn't.
then they can go out and do what they feel like. Obviously, if there was some studies that showed that like games like this hatred game caused people to do that, or even if the game was like touted as like a simulator to practice and then do this in real life, I'd be like, whoa, no. If it was like the flight simulator of committing heinous acts, and it was there so you could practice in the virtual world before doing it for real, then in that case, I'm like, nah, that game can't exist. But if it is solely entertainment, and some people want to live out a weird like power fantasy or whatever, doing some heinous shit, going, yeah, that chills me out after a tough day of work, doing these horrible things in a world where there are no real victims. Yeah, I just think everything should be allowed to exist as long as it doesn't cause any harm to people. And even if inherently violent games well beyond what I would ever think is tasteful or acceptable, if there are people out there that want it to exist and are willing to buy it, and people out there that want it to exist and are willing to make it, and they're happy to exchange money for it, let it happen. And
Oh yeah, like
as long as no one's harmed at the end of the day, people can do whatever the hell they want.
well, that's it. Yeah. If people want to make it and people want to buy it and people want to do it, then fine. What people get up to in the privacy of their own home is completely up to them. But
as long as there are no victims.
As long as there are no victims, yeah. But that was just where the line was for like my personal. Like I would not pick up that game, for example. The fact that it's actually in existence.
Me neither.
Is like,
but
whatever. If they want to make it, I think it's weird. But if they want to make it, then fine. I don't think censorship of it is the right way to go. But it wouldn't be for me.
I think we all agree.
Yeah. Well, that's the way I have my own personal line, and obviously there's a certain point, but then there's like a time and day where there's just some days I'm not feeling like playing any violent games whatsoever, and you want something like zen and relaxing and sort of fun, and then there's other times where there's something like you said, Jim, earlier, that humans have a history of violence and violent tendencies, and we have like millennia of human civilization where we are violent animals to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely something somewhere, if we look into studies, not that you need studies, there's enough examples of it, but that we, to some degree, like violence.
Well, maybe if they don't like it, predisposed to it.
But yeah, and also, there's something about violence that is exhilarating, and I'm not opening a different can of worms with real life violence, but in games, I can really enjoy some violence. Like I want to, as much as we say they don't cause real life violence, whatever. In game, there's something about games that are violent that sometimes just like really do it for me. It doesn't have to be shooting and killing all the time. Like, I'll regularly play the NHL game and get some big hits and just really enjoy that. Like, absolutely like smashing into another player.
Well,
it's fun.
All you have to do,
even though it's not real.
Oh yeah, you just have to look at sports in general. You said the NHL. The number of times when you watch football, you hear football fans saying "get stuck in." You know what I mean? Like, bring it, like, give them, like, not necessarily give them a kick, but like they want you to put in a hard tackle.
Oh yeah, you
like blood sports like UFC, boxing, kickboxing, all sorts of like these things. Blood sports have been around for human history, like the whole of human history.
Yeah.
There is some level within every, well, not maybe not every human, but within many human beings, there's just something that comes out when it comes to violence. I don't know what it is, but there's
They've all
definitely
been watching
something.
Mortal Kombat movies.
Yeah, there's something within human beings that's predisposed to violence, whether that's an act of violence or watching violence. I don't know what it is.
Well,
but
why are people making these violent games?
exactly? Why are people? Why are
they
then
wouldn't be
people
making
buying them? Why do? How many? Archie, you might know how many sales of like Call of Duty are there when the new game comes out?
Tens of millions.
Right, so tens of millions of people don't have a problem with picking up a game where they go around shooting other people. Like, clearly, people think, again, it goes back to the uncomfortable truths. Like, people like to put human beings up on this pedestal, like we're these angelic
So smart.
creatures, and every crime brings us down. I would say we're more in the middle, and we could swing either way.
Thanks for listening to the Indie Bandits podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review in your podcast app of choice. For more on both retro and indie gaming, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitch, where we'll be streaming indie and retro games. Ta-ra for now!